Welcome to the second part of our amazing talk with Vijay Prashad about NATO in the Eastern European context, militarization and imperialism.
We love the fact that you love freedom.
Let's continue talking about the pipelines. More than 1 year ago, Pulitzer Prize winner Seymour Hersh published an article about the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea. He basically says it was an act of sabotage planned by the US in collaboration with Norway. We never had enough evidence to prove Hersh's scenario. Now, we have an ongoing German investigation which tells us, in fact, an Ukrainian sabotage action carried out by Ukrainian diver instructors, so a semi-private initiative with the involvement of the Ukrainian military, but in the end without authorization from the President Zelensky. Three diver instructors, one German rental boat, forget passports, one location in Poland are involved. All this in the story. The Russian authorities accused Germany of not disclosing the source of information according to the international law and having de facto no interest in finding the real culprits. Vijay, tell us, why is the story presented in this form?
Let's just look at the facts. Russia is one of the world's largest reserves of natural gas. It's a big energy provider, member of OPEC plus. Natural gas and oil to Europe for a very long time. In fact, there were several pipelines, one going through Ukraine. In the Maidan conflict, which I think it's very difficult for people to say wasn't exacerbated by the United States government. After all, US high officials were in the Maidan, Victoria Nuland and so on, organizing the new pro-US government. The Russians decided to make a deal with the Germans. They'd already been into that deal to build these two pipelines that came directly from Russia into Germany, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. That's a fact that there were these pipelines. Russia was piping gas in. Those are facts. It's also a fact that the pipeline blew up during the war. I don't think anybody denies that the pipeline blew up. The question remains, who blew up the pipeline? Now, the United States from the beginning said the Russians blew up the pipeline. This is absolutely an absurd thing. You can't even think about it. Why would the Russians blow up their own pipeline? I mean, it's a pipeline that Russia and Germany and other private partners had invested in. Why would they blow up their own pipeline? It just beggars belief, okay? So that's very unlikely of a scenario. Then Seymour Hersh, based on some conversations he had, wrote this article where he made the argument, which I think is as credible as any, that the people he had talked to said the United States government using these divers that were there in Florida who were training and so on, went and blew it up. Okay, that's one scenario. Plausible, but of course we don't have any confirmation. You and I don't have the means to actually go and confirm who really blew it up. But that's what Hersh wrote. Okay. Then comes the next
We
thing
could
that,
ask
well,
for
it was.
funds. Excuse me for interrupting you, but we could ask
Yeah.
for funds in the name of freedom of speech, you know? We could maybe
We should. We
do that.
perhaps should do that. But there's another scenario, the third scenario, right? First scenario is the Russians blew it up themselves, totally preposterous. Second scenario is the Americans blew it up. That's Seymour Hersh. And the third scenario was that the Ukrainians did it. Now, the questions that were raised is, do the Ukrainians have the ability to do this? Well, I don't know. But it's a scenario, three scenarios. Now, why isn't the Bundestag, the German parliament, which owned part of the property of Nord Stream 2, why didn't the Bundestag immediately organize a proper full scale investigation, fully funded? Forget you and I overdo applying for some small funds, forget that. I don't own any piece of the Nord Stream pipeline, nor do you. The Bundestag was a stakeholder here, the German government stakeholder. Why hadn't the Bundestag organized a proper inquiry on this? That actually is remarkable. I mean, because look, there's no point the Duma, the Russian government organizing an inquiry, nobody's going to believe that inquiry, right? In other words, at least in the West, there's not going to be, it's not going to be seen as a credible inquiry. So let's leave the Duma out of it for now, the Russian parliament. But the German parliament, the Bundestag, has a direct stake in this. Why are they not willing to do a proper investigation? There are three scenarios out there. A major piece of infrastructure was destroyed. It was not some natural thing. Godzilla didn't come and bite the pipeline underwater, okay? It wasn't natural destruction, supernatural destruction. It was sabotage, okay? Somebody said, now, are you telling me that I can just fly to Germany and I can destroy public infrastructure and they will not investigate it? Is that the principle that the German government is now putting out there? That you're welcome to come in and destroy infrastructure in Germany and Germany will not investigate it. This strikes me as really, really strange. And by the way, I had earlier mentioned the pipelines being built in Asia. The Power of Siberia 2 is the name of the pipeline I was referring to. There are lots of snags in there. That's why I say every month it gets more and more difficult. What are the snags? The new Mongolian government has said, look, we don't want the pipeline going through Mongolia. They are under pressure from the West. I would take advantage of this and cut a peace deal with the Russians to ensure that the gas comes from Russia into Europe. Because the other side of the coin is that if there is no European market for Russian gas, the Chinese are driving a hard bargain with the Russians, saying we won't pay so much for the gas, we'll pay a lower rate and so on. Freight charges have to be less. They are bargaining hard at that. The Russians have no leverage. They'll be forced to accept the position of the Chinese government, go around Mongolia, all of that stuff. So there still is time for Europe to bargain out of the Ukraine war and cut a deal with the Russians to restart natural gas supply. So, I mean, I just think the clock is ticking, Europe. What do you want? Do you want to burn coal? Do you, the German Green Party, want to burn down the Black Forest so you sit in your homes with old gas, coal fires? Or do you want a cleaner form of energy, natural gas? Not perfect, but cleaner. I mean, the German Green Party, my friends, was founded against nuclear power. Now they are willing to open nuclear power plants in order to keep this war going in Ukraine. I mean, that is the amount of their principled behavior. They have no principles when it comes to their own founding issue, which was the environment. They have become warmongers rather than environmentalists, and this goes across the board. That's why the three-party coalition of Olaf Scholz was so badly defeated in the eastern part of Germany. People are just saying, why are we subsidizing this war? It is bringing no benefit to us. In fact, it's making life more difficult. We've imported the Ukraine war inflation, and it looks like it's not going anywhere. Stop that war. And for Romania, if the Ukraine war ends, let's not start a Romanian war.
Vijay, let's come back to this. We were discussing about pipelines. Let's stay a bit on the topic of infrastructure. Now, with the recovery and resilience plan put forth by the European Commission during the coronavirus pandemic, around 800 billion euros are being pumped into the European economy until 2026. Officially, the funds are aimed at helping member states recover from the pandemic, make economies more sustainable and resilient, and accelerate green and digital transitions. What this achieves, in fact, is boosting the big business sector in Europe to the detriment of the working class and the poor. One key element, however, in this transformation is the integration of the military infrastructure and the logistics into the economy. The so-called dual character of the infrastructure, so that roads, rails, canals, and logistics hubs, such as ports or airports, will serve alternatively commercial and military purposes. Now, we know you spoke on several occasions about the Belt and Road initiative adopted by China in 2013. These very ambitious infrastructure projects spanning Asia, Europe, and Africa. Can you outline some differences between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Recovery and Resilience Plan? Or are they reproducing the same imperialist logic only in different parts of the globe? What's your opinion about this?
You see, most countries in the global south are still poor countries. They need to marshal resources to build their infrastructure and so on. I mean, I know I was once talking to a friend of mine who told me that Romania has one of the fastest internet relations. I'm at the other end of things. My internet is quite terrible. So I don't know how well this
We
is
can
being.
hear that every now and then during our
Yeah, I
conversation.
know
Yeah.
it's terrible. I mean, so most developing countries require some resources to help them build infrastructure. For instance, high speed rail, or even more important, internet tools and so on. Good quality 5G, 6G even tools. Build ports and so on. I mean, a whole range of infrastructure. So then the question is, who's coming with the funds for that infrastructure? Today, nobody has the funds like the Chinese. The Chinese are sitting on a vast surplus. This comes either via People's Bank of China, which is also doing currency swaps. People's Bank of China is doing something interesting. They don't come to a country and say, "Hey, listen, you're going to have to do a deal with us, and dollars is going to be our medium." They say that, look, we are willing to buy your currency, kwachas, for instance, in Zambia, and you can take renminbi. And then, of course, we are willing to swap the renminbi. We can find dollars or other currencies, euros, and so on. They are coming to people and saying, we'll oblige you in any way. Secondly, there's the Belt and Road money. The Belt and Road money comes directly into building infrastructure and so on. Again, it's not just the Chinese government. In some cases, there's funding from other development banks that come in and join in to help build very large scale projects. They lend money. Who's giving the money? Is China giving the money? What are they taking? The question is, do the countries of the global south have a plan for that money? What's happened is that most countries in the south have actually lost confidence in the development paradigm, and have turned to either using that money for consumption or using that money for the export of raw materials. This is a big error. This is reproducing neocolonial structures. Countries of the global south need to build new development paradigms for things like building capital stock, building net fixed capital, building industries, and so on, upgrading their value chain. They can't be just exporting raw materials. So, this is on the countries of the global south, not on the lender. Lenders come and say, we are willing to build high speed rail. Now, we have to have a project and a plan, and our plans and projects have collapsed because, under the influence of the International Monetary Fund, we've got into this habit of encouraging foreign direct investment, taking on large amounts of debt in order to export raw materials. This was the export oriented growth method of the IMF. We have to go beyond that. We need a new development paradigm. So, if the Europeans come and say, look, we have development funding for you, we should take it, but we need to have a plan. I don't think the donor country, the creditor country, has a responsibility to develop the plan. That's imperialist. If they come and say, we want you to take this money to do what we tell you. No, we say we have a plan. You lend us money, we'll pay it back, but we have a plan. We know how to do it. That's sovereignty. And what's happening is now, like when you look at the China Africa summit, they have been debating industrialization. The Chinese are now saying, look, we are willing to invest in infrastructure, but we don't want to invest in infrastructure just to extract raw materials. We would like you to develop an agenda. And I think that's where the conversation is. It's sort of stuck there. It's not advancing, but we need to advance the conversation. I don't think this is a question of the money is colonial. The money is not colonial. The money is necessary. The funds are necessary. The question is, the relationship to the funds can be colonial. Money is merely an instrument. It is embodied social relations. It itself isn't social relations. We need to create a plan. We need to create a way forward and then take the resources and advance. One of the big problems that Europe is facing is currently Europe is spending twice, that is, the European Union is spending twice the amount on weapons than it is on infrastructure. Its infrastructure is roughly 100 billion, it's spending 200 billion on weapons. That's a distortion. I mean, that's one reason why infrastructure Europe wide is not as good as it should be or could be. You know, if you travel to China, you go between Shanghai and Beijing, the train runs at 340 kilometers an hour. In Europe, the maximum speed you're going to get is a little over 100 kilometers an hour. Trains just can't run faster than that. In China, they have developed a prototype for a 600 kilometer an hour train. You know, that means that in a matter of hours, you can go from, say, Romania to Germany. You shouldn't need to fly if trains are that fast. That's going to have an impact on climate and the climate catastrophe. The less people that fly, let's say, within Europe and instead take trains that are super fast, the better for the planet, because those trains have a much lower carbon footprint than flights. So there's a big discussion to be had about what kind of society you want to live in. I mean, one of the creative aspects is to take advantage of this sort of block in thinking about how to develop a country and build a new development paradigm. It's not only for Zambia or for Paraguay, it's also for Romania. What is your development paradigm? How do the Romanian people want to live? If you are European, how do you from Romania go to, let's say, Belgrade, neighboring country? Do you have to drive? Can you take a train? Do you have to fly? I mean, how do you want to live your life? How do goods move and so on? Where do people go for holiday? What is expensive? What is affordable? These are the real questions for people, not what length of ICBM do you want to have in a silo sitting somewhere in eastern Romania. I mean, that should not be what a government is thinking about. Preparing for war with Russia should not be what a government in Romania is thinking about. Government in Romania should be thinking about how do we advance the interests of our people? How do we create 8G internet? Let's go all the way. How do we create internet where we are able to do things that we just can't do today? Where we are able to have meetings where we can see things and do things and inspire each other without the flatness of the screen. Is that possible? That's the kind of thinking we need, so that we can also then get our work done here and then spend 2 hours lying on my couch and reading. Genuine leisure. The whole purpose of life is not work. That's what the Nazis put out. Work makes you free. No, what makes you free is freedom. We should have the freedom to be political people, the freedom to go for a walk, freedom to do a million things. That's a pursuit of life. Where's the plan for that? Is the Romanian government is obsessed. Security, security, security. Not happiness, happiness, happiness. And I think that is a moral objection I have with neoliberal governments. They are obsessed with security and they don't think about the happiness of their people.
Vijay, for our last few minutes, we just want to ask you about this order that the President Joe Biden gave to Pentagon a few days ago to get ready, to get coordinated for nuclear confrontation with Russia, China, and North Korea. We see that it's a significant change in the U.S. foreign policy. What would you say is there any material goal for which this shift is made?
It's so hard to understand why this statement was made. We know that the United States has nuclear weapons. We know it's capable of utilizing the nuclear weapons. We know that they are at ready, that they are always being checked and so on. We know that the US military has them at standby. We know all that. So what's the need of a public statement? Like, are you, by making a public statement, was Joe Biden saying, until yesterday or until an hour ago, the nuclear missiles were all sort of lock and key, shut down. There was no, I mean, what are they saying? Obviously, what he said isn't what they had to then do. Obviously, it was a statement. It was a political statement, not an instruction to the military, because the military already had the arsenal ready to go. So, unless, of course, I'm missing something, and for the last 10 years or 4 years, the nuclear arsenal was asleep. Obviously, this was not an instruction to the generals to wake up the nuclear arsenal. No, that was already awake. This is the statement to the world. This is the United States president saying, I am willing to fire a nuclear missile, first strike, against anybody who we feel threatens us. This is a very dangerous political escalation. Think of the message that this sends to China and to Russia. Forget North Korea for now. Forget North Korea. The reason I say forget North Korea, because I don't think the North Koreans have not been seized of the fact that they might get flattened any minute, which is why they are so aggressive about defending themselves. But China and Russia, the Chinese, very large section of the Chinese government believes that any minute now they can restart the dialogue with the United States. They don't see the fact that the US might be permanently cutting ties with China. They think, well, at some point, the United States is going to wake up to the reality that it's better to have a collaboration than a confrontation. Not sure it's true. But now, with this statement, it reaffirms the fear that the United States government at any point can put mid range nuclear missiles in Taiwan or in Darwin, Australia, or in the Philippines and directly threaten Beijing with a nuclear strike. The Russians already fear, and that's why they entered Ukraine, that the United States could place mid-range nuclear missiles in any of these ports of call in the Baltic states, two of them members of NATO, in Ukraine, in Georgia and Romania, wherever, and threaten Moscow, St. Petersburg, the major cities, in the West. Of course, some of the buildup in the East, which threatens China, could also threaten Russian cities in the East. These are all tangible realities for Russia and China. This was a direct political statement to Putin and Xi Jinping. And I really hope the United States, at least at some time in the immediate period, is going to walk back applications of that statement. I mean, the United States needs to return to the table to renegotiate with the Russians and perhaps with the Chinese at the table the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which the United States walked out of in 2002 unilaterally. George W. Bush tore up the treaty, left it, and Trump unilaterally tore up the Intermediate Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. I very much hope, but I don't think there's any basis for my hope, mainly just hope for the planet, that the United States is going to return to negotiations with Russia, perhaps with China, to have a new anti-ballistics missile treaty, or at least to reaffirm the framework of it, and to have a new or reaffirm the INF treaty. Because absent that, there is no confidence in either Moscow or Beijing that the US government isn't going to use nuclear weapons to prevent the development of these countries. Remember, that's the goal. United States has openly said we don't want near peer rivals to advance. They've openly said that. That's what Jim Mattis said when he was US Secretary of Defense. No Secretary of Defense since then, including currently Lloyd Austin, has contradicted that statement. Lloyd Austin went to Kiev and said, we need to weaken Russia so that it doesn't do this again. In other words, invade a neighbor. Weaken Russia. Those are very clear words to Moscow. If I was in the Russian government, I would be very afraid of these statements. I would say this makes us even more belligerent, not less. More worried about the imperatives of security, and therefore less and less willing to negotiate in Ukraine. That's the goal, to prevent negotiation in Ukraine. This is not about waking up the generals and sending them to man the nuclear missiles. It's a statement to Moscow saying, we are not willing to negotiate with you, which makes the Russians say, well, then why should we come to the table? Even if Belarus wants to, even if the Turks insist again in holding a thing, why should we come to the table? Because look at what the United States is doing. I mean, the Russians might say the only way we'll negotiate with Ukraine is if NATO and the US are sitting there in the room and giving us security guarantees. Highly unlikely. It's a dangerous move by Biden. And I hope the US will, in some ways, walk this back.
Vijay, thanks a lot for this insightful discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care of yourselves.